Meet Josh. Josh loves drumming. When he's not practicing, he's performing. And when he's not performing, he's practicing. Oh, and did we mention? Josh loves drumming. And that's why he chooses DBud. Hey Josh, show us your skills. Thanks, Josh. Noise harms your health. Josh knows that. He also knows that gigs get very loud. DBud's volume slider means that he can slide from minus 11 decibels to minus 24 decibels in the flick of a switch. And that's why Josh loves DBud. The problem with cheap earplugs is they often kill both the volume and the sound. The lower tones cut through the earplugs more than the higher ones. The bass overpowers the treble. There's an uneven attenuation of high and low frequencies, an unbalanced distorted sound. Yes, they protect your ears, but you get a muffled and dull sound experience. DBud isn't like that. Don't lose your hearing or peace of mind. Get DBud today.
My first memories of music has to be, we used to live in Islington. We grew up in Islington, Gary and I, and we shared a bedroom that was in a place called Rotherfield Street in Islington. And it was right next door to a boozer, to a pub called Clarendon Arms. And every Saturday night, or Friday as well, I suppose, at the weekends, it was always kind of like Roll Out the Barrel and Knees Up Mother Brown was going on. And my bedroom used to rattle with it. Everybody in the pub singing along, and the old Joanna banging away, and that was my first memory of music. And even though it used to keep me awake, it wasn't horrible. This was really nice. It was kind of a comforting, warm sound that I loved. And the worst bit was, you know, when they used to deliver the barrels at about 6 o'clock in the morning and roll them down the cobble streets. That noise was really bad. But the music that used to come out of the pub was just absolutely lovely. And I think that was my first introduction to music. And then Gary was given a guitar one Christmas that he hated because he wanted a toy, you know, he didn't want a guitar. So, and that used to hang on the wall. And as they were singing Knees Up Mother Brown and Roll Out the Barrel and all those classic pub songs, Gary's guitar used to rattle on the wall. It would like vibrate. Zzz. So it was almost kind of like, you know, come and play me, come and pick me up sound that it had. And that was my introduction really to music.
And you know, when did you start like getting into bands or buying your own records or getting into
first record
stuff on the radio?
First record I ever bought was Me and My Life by the Tremolos. Now, why I bought it, I've got no clue at all. I think I was actually bullied into buying it by my brother, right? Who one Saturday said to me, "Let's go up to the local record shop and we'll spend our pocket money on a couple of singles." And Gary bought the Kinks 8-Man, that record, classic record. And for some reason, I chose Me and My Life, the Tremolos, right? Which is just awful record to have as your first record you ever bought. But, and I took it home and I played it to death because my mum and dad used to play music on a Sunday morning when I was really small. But that would only be like Frank Sinatra and Matt Monroe, and they would only have about 6 or 7 records anyway, you know, because they couldn't afford any. So they were all kind of practically worn out and thin, paper thin. So these records that Gary and I bought, and we brought them back, and that really was the beginning of a record collection that I started, and falling in love with, I went through everything from glam rock to punk rock to heavy rock. I've been through the whole rock system.
Yeah. Well, all of those kind of influences you can hear in the music that you went on to make. Now, one thing that really kind of fascinated me and kind of impressed me or, you know, astounded me really, was, and you know, this could be a misconception because you know, the internet throws all sorts of crazy stories at you.
Sure.
But how did things actually start with Spandau Ballet in the sense, especially of you learning the bass guitar? Because by all accounts, it seems like you picked this up like ridiculously quickly before joining the band.
It's a bit of a fallacy that, because I tell you exactly what happened. You know, was I was really into punk, and I love punk. I love that whole system of not having to be a great musician. You know, the first concerts that I ever saw that I went along to with my brother was Earl's Court, and I went to see Pink Floyd. I went to see Man, Deke Leonard's Man, the Rolling Stones. And you had to be pretty good musicians, you know, to play that stuff. But punk enabled you, and it told you that you didn't have to be that great. It was just, you know, it was about the whole package. And so I absolutely fell in love with it. And I was going to see, you know, I was down to Roxy and going to see bands like Buzzcocks and Generation X and The Clash and anything I could, anything. And I absolutely fell in love with it. So when I went back to school, I put together a little band with my mates who couldn't play as well. You know, we just about put together 3 chords, but it was good enough for punk. And we put together a band called The Defects, which only ever played 1 show. And that was a disaster because the electricity went down halfway through. So not great memories, but it was a great building block. It was a great stepping stone for me. And then, you know, so I fell in love with punk, and I picked up a guitar and I played guitar in that band, and I probably learnt the 3 chords that you were meant to learn as a punk guitarist. And so by the time the band came along, Spandau Ballet or Gentry, and Gary asked me to, on that, you know, fateful day, to be in the band and to learn 12 songs, I could already kind of play a little bit of guitar. So learning to play 12 songs on bass, even though it was really difficult, I have to say, you know, it wasn't an easy thing to do. Within like 3 months to do the first show with Spandau Ballet. I kind of like, I think I had a little bit of an advantage.
Yeah. If you pick up the guitar first, that, you know, that, I have to say that's cheating compared to the bio that I read, but it's still unbelievably impressive.
Because what it does, it just makes sure that your hand is in the right position. You know, when you learn to play guitar, a lot of people, you know, look kind of cack-handed because they can't quite work it out where to put your wrist. But if you've already formed that position, then swapping from a guitar to a bass guitar isn't bad. You know, even though I only had 3 chords that I knew, you know, probably still know. But you know, that was my kind of introduction. But I tell you how I got into the band, how it started for me, was they used to be called the Gentry, and they used to be called the Makers before that. And it was kind of like a school band Gary had with his mates. You know, one of those bands that would play in a school music room, would go out and play tiny little pubs and venues just to their mates, really. And I was their roadie. I used to carry the equipment for them and set it up. And I hated it, absolutely hated it. I was so jealous. You can't imagine how that felt. And then one day I was at a party, Steve Norman's 18th birthday party. Steve Norman is the saxophone player in the band, you know, and the good-looking fella. And he was 18, and it was at his mum and dad's house, and we'd drunk too much homemade beer. And Steve Dagger, who was the manager of the Makers at that point, Gary's band, out of the blue, complete blue, asked me to be in the band and asked me to play guitar. And he said, listen, I want you to be in the band. I think you should be on top of the pops with us. I want to get rid of the bass player. And I was straight away, I'm thinking, oh my God, you know, who's going to tell him? And I'm going to get rid of the bass player and I want you to do it. So it was kind of like, I'm a big believer in those moments in life where these windows open up and you can walk through them. and you only get about 3 or 4 of those in a lifetime, you know, that can change your life. And that was the first one that ever turned up for me. So I said yes, learned to play the bass guitar, like I was telling you, you know, in 3 months. And then we stepped out and did our first show. And what I remember, it was really good. It was a good show. I mean, the band was great, you know. They always were. Gary and John on drums and Steve Norman on guitar as well, and Tony singing. They were a really good bunch of young musicians playing. So it wasn't hard to join in and step along and get into the right time with it. And it was just a complete pleasure for me. I can't tell you. It was like the world opening up.
Yeah, I can imagine. In terms of the way that you guys exploded and became, you know, so huge in the 80s. You know, what would you say was the turning point? Was it almost from the word go that things started to move in the right direction, or was there a kind of particular moment along the way where you sort of thought, okay, now things are going really well?
I tell you the truth. I think it was from the word go. It was absolutely from the minute it was put together. It was. I've looked back at a few bits of film recently. Something we were doing, putting together a documentary, and we must have only been like 17, 18. But it was a really good band. It had great songs. It played the instruments really well. It was a really good band. And on top of that, we were 5 good-looking young kids. And so it had all the right elements to be successful. And there was no hanging around. There was no, as soon as it became Spandau Ballet, it was no hanging around. It was straight. There was none of that, let's travel the country and play all these dirty shows in the back of a white transit. It wasn't that. It was, let's put together some tasty shows that people of a certain ilk, you know, certain pop culture will come to see. And we became, I suppose, the head of that pop culture in the way that The Who was the band that all the mods went to see, or the Rolling Stones was that all the rockers went to see. We became the band that all of those new romantic kids came to see. Which,
yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
New Romantic, say what you like about it, and you can laugh at it because of the clothes that people wore, but it was the last of the great pop cultures. So I'm really proud of that.
Yeah, and rightly so. What's interesting about the New Romantic era, and I don't know, you guys made some extremely melodic music, right? And and you were very influenced by punk, and you know, Simply Red don't fall into New Romantic era that much, but it's just interesting that you know, a band. You guys, there are similarities in some of the music that you guys make, and again, I was kind of very confused that Mick Hucknall was influenced by punk as well. And what is it with all these bands, these from the 80s, making such kind of amazing melody driven music influenced by punk?
You know, but if you look at the early days of Spandau, like the first couple of records, they were, you can tell they're influenced by punk.
Yeah, much more.
Was just a rock band, a basic rock band with the guitar stripped away and a keyboard, a synth put in. And it was, 1980 wasn't just the birth of all of those pop bands, it was the birth of synthesizers and a different sound that was coming along as well. And the two things grew together. You know, we had, to cut a long story short, and the Freeze, I think, that were really influenced by punk and also the electronic music that we were listening to in the Blitz, in the club, you know, in the around New Romantic era. So I think those two were influenced by that. But later on, when we started doing that melodic pop, that kind of true album, I think we'd kind of left our cult status behind, and we understood then that you can't be a cult band forever. You've got to move on and move away from it if you want to play Wembley Arena. You know? It's all very well being a cult band if you want to stick to Hammersmith Odeon, but if you want to go and play Wembley Arena or Wembley Stadium and that kind of sound, you've got to be bigger than that. And so we kind of like moved naturally into recording those songs, those melodic songs that you're talking about, on the True album, that kind of sound a little bit Simply Red.
Yeah,
I understand Simply Red as well, because it goes back to what I was saying with, at the same time though, the bands were growing, the idea of synthesizers and the sounds were growing as well. And the sounds that we were getting out of the synths at that point that we'd never had before, never had the opportunity to work with before, were in front of us. So everybody was playing those synths, hearing it, and then thinking, oh my goodness, you can sing these lovely melodies to it. It becomes kind of a little bit laid back in a way. And you had Trevor Horn producing records for ABC and Grace Jones that were sounds that we'd never heard before. Those records, when you listen back to them now, or they stand the test of time now, they're so good. But
absolutely.
But at that point in the 1980s, when Trevor was making those records, that was the pinnacle of sounds. Everybody wanted to sound like that because it was brand new and it was incredible.
Yeah, it was interesting that you said, New Romantic era was kind of the last great pop culture era. I mean, in terms of the sonics of records, I think the 1980s, this is my view, and many people will disagree, but I think the 1980s was the last time that we heard musically and sonically anything, that new in popular music. Now, like all the artists of the day, all the artists in the charts now, they're basically making like 80s disco music, like Dua Lipa and The Weeknd. Like those albums are fantastic, but they're nothing new from what was made in the 80s. I feel like it was the last fresh thing.
Absolutely, because if you look at the change between the 70s, if you go back and play a 1970s record, and you listen to the sound that they were getting and making, and then you play a 1980s record produced by Trevor Horn, say, Grace Jones or something, ABC, and the difference is incredible.
Yeah.
Kind of like it goes forward leaps and bounds. It's a massive change.
Yeah, the Trevor Horn record. I mean, I've had John Anderson from Yes on the show, and I think a lot of Yes fans resent the 80s switch, and he himself didn't seem that keen on the 80s thing. But I personally think Owner of a Lonely Heart, like that, I mean, because that was, of course, a great Trevor Horn production. I mean,
it's a Trevor Horn
unbelievable.
It's a great record. It's unbelievable, but I prefer the old Yes.
You prefer the old Yes as well, yeah. I mean, I know what you mean. The harmonies.
Yeah,
the harmonies are beautiful.
You know what I think I prefer about the old Yes? Are the record covers. Because the covers used to be such a big part of buying an album in those days. I think, the music business kind of fell apart when we went to CDs, when all of a sudden it wasn't the record that shrank, it was the cover that shrank. And that whole experience of buying this 12 by 12 piece of cardboard that had pictures and information on, as well as the record that you were buying. And you had to, you played that record in two halves. So, and it was kind of laid out like a show, like a small piece of theatre, in the way that the crescendo would come to the end of the album, and, it would build up like that, and you would have the slow song as the third song. I mean, nowadays you make an album and, your best 1, 2, and 3 tracks on the album go number 1, 2, and 3 because it's good for iTunes. There isn't that anymore. And so I think the record business lost everything when CDs came in.
Yeah. Do you think it's become, because that whole ritual of, opening up the record, looking at the liner notes, and it is more of a kind of involved process. Yeah. And that type of, being a music fan, has that become really quite niche? And do you think, like, I feel like amongst my mates, there's, and definitely people younger than me, that it's almost just like music doesn't have that much value compared to other pieces of disposable content. If someone films like a video of them, like, playing a prank on someone else, that makes them laugh, and someone makes like a 3-minute song that takes like months to produce and costs loads of money, you know, it's the end result that people care about, what's entertaining. And so in that sense, is music becoming outdated? Is pop music becoming outdated as just another short form piece of content?
Outdated as such. I think it's become cheapened, you know,
Yeah.
by the way that we look at it now. And I think it's such a terrible, terrible shame. You know, I know a few of my mates, young friends that have got bands, and it's just, where do they go? What do they do? How do you get to that point where you can make money, enough money to spend your time doing it? You know, because they can't, if you're just starting out and you're making records, making music, you can't fill out an auditorium yet to get the ticket value to make money from concerts. So you have to make money from records and make money from iTunes and Spotify, and there is no money to be made there.
Yeah,
so it's a vicious circle. But you know, I talk about the golden days of music as being the 70s and the 80s, you know, because that's where I grew up at. And you know, when I used to speak to my mum and dad about their golden age of music, it was the 60s. You know, the end of the 50s, because that's where they grew up. So I look back at the 70s and the 80s, you know, through rose-tinted glasses, of course. But, you know, at least we were given the chance that if we were successful, we could make money from it and you could call it a job. But nowadays, to get in that position, it's really difficult.
Yeah. Do you think it's harder? I guess it's that whole equation that people wrestle with. It's like, to become good, you need to put the time in, but a man's got to eat. So it's like, to have the time, you know, you want to be making your money off it. But if you can't get money from live, then you've got to get another job, and then you're not good enough to actually be good enough. So it's all just a complete headache. What would your advice be to young musicians? I mean, I'm not expecting you to have the answers, of course.
No, I don't have the answer. The advice that I always give people, and this goes for acting as well, is my advice is always treat it as a hobby. And if you make money out of it, then fantastic. You know, that's a bonus. And that was the way that I treated growing up in a band and growing up being a young child actor, was that it was always, even now I look at it like that, to be honest, is that it was always and still is my hobby. And if I make money of it, then it's a bonus.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of looking at it, because also I think if you remove the hobby element, the element where you're doing it because you love it, then it's a slippery slope. It can actually turn into something that you hate if it's causing you this much stress.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do love it, and it is your hobby. That's why so many kids dream about being actors and being musicians. Is because what you're really doing is your hobby, and what you're doing what you love to do, rather than just going to a job. Yeah,
absolutely. In terms of the new romantic era, what are the other groups that you would consider like people who epitomize that era, who you kind of really admired, or was the rivalry too intense?
Oh no, it was great. Music was being made by everyone at that time. You know, when we started, we knew that there was another club in England called the Rum Runner that Duran Duran came out of, and it was, we knew we kind of had it split then. You know, the cult status was split, where you know, I suppose it split at the Watford Gap, where it was Spandau in the south and then Duran Duran in the north of England, and they were a great band, you know, exactly the same as Spandau, but there were other bands that I went to see at that time that I loved. Like, I always felt Depeche Mode, even though they didn't want to be in that category of new romantic, I always thought they were. You know, Boy George was, what great songs Boy George came out with, you know. And the first time I ever saw Boy George, we were playing on stage in the Blitz, and it was Steve Strange's birthday night, and he'd invited Spandau to go down and play. And as I'm playing, I remember clearly Boy George is taking the coats in the cloakroom, and taking people's money for doing that. And he was literally the cloakroom boy. So, you know, and in that club, in the Blitz alone, there was so many bands that came out of there. Ultravox came out there, you know, Culture Club, Spandau, Shirlie came out there.
Yeah, Sade's incredible.
It was just a hub of all of these incredible young musicians that went on to prove themselves.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So do you have any regrets about, you know, the band splitting up, and, you know, do you wish you'd continued for longer, or do you have no regrets? Because, I mean, of course, you've gone on to achieve incredible success, and this must be, you know, it's not that many people who managed to kind of go over from music into acting and other areas of the entertainment business. It's notoriously pretty tricky to do that.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. It's do I have any regrets? Yeah, I have regrets that the way we ended up, that the way that even today that we don't all really speak to each other, which I think is just really sad. My regrets are more about our friendship than they are about the band. You know, if I played in the band again, I would love to do it, you know, because I think when you play in a band, what you really get addicted to is volume. And it's something that you never experience. You know, if you play a power chord and everybody plays it together in front of like 20,000 people and they all stand up and cheer at the same time, it's an incredible vibe. It's an incredible piece of adrenaline that goes through your body. And you miss that. You miss the camaraderie with you and your mates. But the actual being in the band is kind of, you know, once you've done it and you've been around the world doing it several times, it becomes a little bit of a day job in the same way anything else does. And you're always battling. You know, I'm rattling off stuff that's bad about being in a band, but it is good. It's good fun, right? But, you know, it becomes a little bit of a day job. And it's also the thing that I always found really hard, especially in the younger years, was that you judge your life by a number. And that's what number you are in the charts that week. If you're number one, you feel like a number one person. If you're number 35, you feel like a number 35 person, which isn't great.
Yeah.
And, you know, you're constantly waiting there to see what number you're going to feel like next week and the week after. And I hated that, absolutely hated that part of being in the band. But what I miss about it the most are having my mates, and about probably the way I treated my mates over the years and recently, and to end up with losing most of them. And I regret that incredibly, but that's things happen along the way, and it's very difficult to turn the clock back and say, oh, make out it never happened.
Yeah, it really is, and it's something that happens time and time again. So many great bands have troubles like that, and I mean, so many artists in music, you know, they express frustration. Like, you know, I think even Michael Jackson after Thriller said, you know, I need to sell more copies than that, and put himself under all that pressure. Once you get to number one, it's like human nature is you want to stay there, and that's just impossible. No artists have ever managed to just get to number one, no matter if they're, you know, Paul McCartney or, you know, Michael Jackson or whoever.
I found it a little bit like, you know, that thing of listening to Neil Armstrong, even though it's miles away, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin. Once you've been to the moon and you've walked on it, where'd you go after that? You know, basically you fucked, because, you know, do you know what I mean? Everything is downhill after that. And when you start out in a band, what you have is this constant thing of not appreciating where you are, right? Because when you're a kid, what you want is you want to have a number one record and you want to play Hammersmith Odeon. But when you get to Hammersmith Odeon, by the time you've got there, what your brain is saying is, I want to be playing Wembley Arena, right, to 10,000 people. But by the time you get to Wembley Arena, what your brain is saying then and telling you is, I want to play Wembley Stadium. So you never really stand back and appreciate where you are and what you're doing and how well you've done, you know, because your brain is always saying, let's get to the next bit. But when you get to the end and there isn't a next bit, then it becomes a little bit difficult. And that's why I completely understand when the Beatles got to Sgt. Pepper's album and they said, you know, we don't want to make these records anymore. Let's do it in kind of caricature form. Let's form these characters that aren't really us so that we can get away with doing something that isn't really us. And when they got to Let It Be album, the Let It Be album wasn't even meant to be an album. It was meant to be just a session of rehearsals, really, so they could go and record the record in, you know, on the roof.
Yeah, they were going to do a live gig, weren't they?
Yeah,
they were basically rehearsing to cut it live.
Basically rehearsing, but which turns out to be, which I think personally is probably the best album ever made, right? That along with Eat It, Humble Pie, right? My two favourite albums ever made. But Let It Be is a great example of that, of getting to the top and then realising there's nowhere else to go. You know,
yeah.
And, so let's get in, make a record. But probably because they stopped touring and because they stopped, you know, that want to get bigger and bigger, probably that's why the Let It Be album is as good as it is.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. How does moving into the acting world differ in terms of your relationship with it and the pressure that you put yourself under? Is it different, or is it, you know, much the same really?
I always like to think entertainment, the world of entertainment is a big bubble. And inside that bubble, you have lots of different ways of entertaining people, you know, whether it's being in a band or whether it's acting or whether it's presenting or even directing, you know, movies. I always like to see it as inside a bubble so that I can move around inside it. I think they're kind of, acting is a much more personal thing. You know, when you're up on stage as a band, or when you make a record, it's a piece of theatre that you're making, really. I always have a problem with understanding why being on stage with a band is called kind of rock and roll, and you know, every night it's like a party, where it's exactly the same really as doing a theatre show. You're doing exactly the same moves and exactly the same chords and exactly the same moments happen every night. It's just that, you know, different audiences don't see it every night. And the ones that do stand back and say, why are they playing the same songs in the same order? But it's, so for me, they're pretty much all wrapped up in this bubble called entertainment. And I kind of feel that probably acting is a little bit more personal, you know? Maybe what you feel when you're acting is what Tony used to feel as a singer, where he would act those songs out every night and they would become personal to him. And they were personal to Gary because they were Gary's songs. Gary wrote them. So maybe those two had that feeling. But for me, playing bass guitar in that band, it wasn't personal for me. It was about playing the part of a rock star, you know. And where I find when I act, it's a personal thing. And it comes from inside me, and you find out more about yourself. And it's kind of like each time you take on a different part is a kind of cheap therapy session in a way, because you kind of find out more about you. You know, if you find the violent bit in you, you find the bit that is the lover in you, and you find the bit that is fucking boring as well. You know, so. I think it's more of a kind of cheap therapy session for me. So it's definitely more personal for me, acting.
That's really interesting. And interesting what you said about the sort of the difference between playing and singing. But it's, I mean, obviously there have been examples of people who've done both in the past, but it's definitely very, very interesting to be able to do both, and must be an incredible experience. So you've written a book that came out in October last year, right? about yours and your wife's relationship, which has been how long now? Like 30 something years, 35 years? Well, your marriage.
We've been together about 40 years.
40 years, wow.
I think we've been married 35 years, 36 years. But, you know, the book came out, but that was the second book I ever wrote. You know, I wrote another biography called True, which came out about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I think now. And I love that whole process of putting it together and writing, and I love that. It's a great excuse when you're writing to go and sit in your TV room, sit over there with a laptop, close the door and say to Shirlie, I'm working. I need peace and quiet with a cup of coffee and some biscuits. It's a great excuse. You're laughing because you know exactly what I'm talking about, right?
I do.
It's a great excuse to close the doors. And I love writing. I love it, you know, and I wrote a couple of movies a way back. And going back to the acting thing, really, I think the thing that I've most enjoyed in my life probably is directing, because then you get to use all of your hobbies in one project, and that's kind of like acting and filming and cinematography and music that underscores everything else, pins everything down, and you get to use all of those hobbies in one go, you know, and I love that so much. But writing books is just as good. I really enjoy that, and I'm in the middle of one at the moment that I'm struggling with.
What's this one going to be about?
It's a piece of fiction.
Oh, right.
I've always wanted to do. So I'm working on that. So
that's
Shirlie,
amazing.
get the coffee on.
So I mean, I think it was a great thing to put out some positivity, because we all need it, you know. Yeah, and the book's called It's a Love Story. I'd recommend to all my listeners to go and pick up a copy.
Thank you very much.
Because, you know, it's very important at this time that we're not always reading about misery. And my final question for you, as this is the Greatest Music of All Time podcast, and it's been a great success to avoid lingering on coronavirus this episode. So I wanted
I'm so bored with it, aren't you?
Yeah, me too.
It's a terrible thing. I'm bored of being at home. I'm bored with everything about it. Some days, the last 3 days, I've literally avoided the news so that I feel a bit better, because what I found, it was the news that was bringing me down. You know, it was making me think about it all the time and worry about it. So now I'm just treating it every day like a Sunday.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to go about it. Avoiding the news, you can easily get addicted to the news.
Yeah.
But I was wondering whether you've been kind of listening to a song or an album or a track recently that's been helping you kind of get through, and if so, what is that?
Okay, I'll tell you exactly what I've been doing recently to help me get through it. Is, if we go back to when I was talking about CDs ruining music, you know, and taking away the vinyl album, which I really believe. So when CDs did come around, I was stupid enough to get rid of my whole collection of vinyl records and just move it over to CDs. And I think I gave them all my vinyls away. So now I have the great pleasure of trying to find all those albums that I used to have, and I buy them one by one, right? And every time I buy one, I put it on the shelf, and then I download the same record, because, you know, they don't sound that great, even though you've got a nice system and stuff. But I download the record and I take it on my exercise bike that is out in my garden, right? That I love exercising outside, right, in the fresh air. It's the way to do it, I think. Definitely. And my exercise bike is on a patio in my garden, and I get on there every day and listen to the album that I've just bought and downloaded, and so that I know that album all over again. I've been through everything. I've been through the Beatles. I've been over the last lockdown. I've been through Humble Pie from beginning to end, Alice Cooper from beginning to end. But the record that I keep going back, there's 2 records that I keep going back to that I try not to, but I do. And that one is the Let It Be album. that I just think's a piece of genius. And the other one is Eat It by Humble Pie. And because if you listen to that album, Steve Marriott, incredible, what an incredible voice that man had. It's an amalgamation of like 3 or 4 different styles of music. And it is one of the best albums ever made. It's this great blues album. It's a great gospel album. It's a great rock album. It's just all of the things that I love put into one album. And all of the styles of music that I've grown up loving, produced with great songs. And Steve Marriott's voice was just one of the best rock voices that I've ever come across in my life. So that's, I can't really give you one, but I will give you 2, those 2. But That's been my escapism from lockdown. Every hour, every day, I would go outside on my bike for an hour and play the latest record piece of vinyl that I've just bought.
That is a great way to get through it. And I was thinking of getting something going myself. I mean, it's difficult if you're doing I find it really difficult to listen to music if you're trying to do weights and stuff.
Yeah,
especially because I'm so bloody weak naturally. So I can't.
Man, I tell you what, the only way to do weights is AC/DC.
Yeah, well, there are types of music that will help you. AC/DC.
Yeah, man. You got AC/DC or some Alice Cooper lets you do weights.
Yeah.
And then, but you've got to find the right sort of music for the right thing. And,
yeah, that's very true.
Because when you do bike, you don't really just sit on a bike, do you? You stand up when it gets to the chorus, and you pump it on the crescendo, and you do all of that. And it is absolutely the moment of my day that gives me relief from this whole pile of shite that's going on at the moment.
Yeah, the escapism of music and exercise. But yeah, the Humble Pie album, I need to revisit it. Let It Be, I've listened to almost too many times, so I'm looking forward to.
Yeah.
I can never get bored of it. The
classic album, Humble Pie album, is Rockin' the Fillmore. Right, that's the one that I grew up on, Rockin' the Fillmore, the live album. But the best Humble Pie album is Eat It.
If you're enjoying the Greatest Music of All Time podcast, you can keep up to date with all of our latest episodes for free by subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube, the subscribe button is located at the top of the Tom Cridland YouTube page. It's also at the bottom right of any video that you watch on YouTube. If you're listening on an audio platform, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can subscribe at the top of the page.